Virginia, 1847. The auction block in Richmond sweltered under the August sun. Plantation owner Cornelius Whitmore stood with his ledger, calculating which bodies would best serve his cotton fields. His overseer, a scarred man named Silas Crow, pointed toward the end of the line. "That one's been passed over 3 times today, Mr. Whitmore." The man was tall and gaunt, with skin like polished mahogany and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at things. His name, the auctioneer said, was Ezekiel, though he spoke not a word to confirm it. He came from a plantation in South Carolina that had mysteriously burned to the ground, all 23 souls perishing in the flames, save him. "Why's he still available?" Cornelius asked, suspicious of any bargain. The auctioneer, a portly man named Thaddeus Boone, wiped sweat from his jowls. "Superstitious talk, sir. Previous owner's family claimed. Peculiar things. But a strong back is a strong back, and his papers say he's capable." Cornelius bought Ezekiel for half the price of a field hand. That first night at Whitmore Plantation, the other enslaved people gave Ezekiel wide berth in the quarters. An elderly woman named Temperance finally approached him with a tin cup of water. "You got the mark," she whispered, her eyes fixed on a small symbol barely visible on his inner wrist, a circle with 7 lines radiating outward. "My grandmother knew that mark, said it was older than chains, older than ships." Ezekiel drank the water slowly, his gaze drifting toward the great house where lamplight flickered in the windows. "They always stop me at first," he said quietly. "They always think their locks will hold." Cornelius Whitmore's wife, Abigail, was a delicate woman who took laudanum for her nerves and rarely left her chambers. Their daughter, 17-year-old Prudence, played piano and embroidered, dreaming of suitors who might rescue her from the suffocating heat and monotony of plantation life. Their son, Nathaniel, 22 and cruel, managed the overseers with his father and took pleasure in the work. That night, Abigail woke to find a figure standing at the foot of her bed. The Negro from the auction, Ezekiel, stood perfectly still in her bedroom, though she had heard no door open, no floorboard creak. Moonlight from the window cast him in silver. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound emerged. Her throat constricted as if wrapped in invisible wire. "You took a child from its mother," Ezekiel said, his voice soft as falling ash. "Sold her south to New Orleans. The mother, Dinah, wept for 3 days until she lost her voice." Abigail's eyes bulged with terror. She had ordered that sale herself, annoyed by the woman's wailing infant during her afternoon rest. "I am not here to harm you," Ezekiel continued, "only to show you what you've done." He extended his hand, and Abigail felt herself falling, not physically, but internally. Suddenly she was Dinah, feeling the weight of empty arms, the ache of breasts full of milk for a child torn away, the despair so complete that breathing itself became an act of torture. When Abigail gasped back into her own body, dawn light filtered through the curtains. Ezekiel was gone. She rang frantically for her maid, but when Cornelius arrived, she could barely speak of it. He dismissed it as laudanum dreams. But that morning, Abigail instructed her husband to purchase back Dinah's child, whatever the cost. Cornelius, baffled but obedient to his wife's rare insistence, complied. Silas Crow ruled the fields with a whip and a hatred that ran marrow-deep. He'd been overseer at Whitmore Plantation for 6 years, and in that time, 4 enslaved people had died under his supervision, beatings that went too far, accidents that were anything but. He noticed Ezekiel never looked away when their eyes met. Every other slave dropped their gaze, but Ezekiel stared with those penetrating eyes, as if reading ledgers written on Silas's soul. 3 nights after Ezekiel's arrival, Silas woke in his small house near the stables to find the slave sitting in the chair beside his bed. How the hell? Silas reached for the pistol on his nightstand, but his hand wouldn't obey. His entire body was paralyzed except for his eyes and lungs. "You killed a man named Joshua," Ezekiel said. "Beat him to death for looking at you wrong. You buried him in the woods past the north field." Silas's heart hammered against his ribs. No one knew about Joshua. He told the Whitmores the man had run off. "You killed a woman named Ruth, whipped her while she was with child. She bled out in the quarters while you slept soundly." Tears leaked from Silas's frozen eyes. "You killed a boy named Samuel, worked him in the sun without water until his heart stopped. He was 12 years old." Ezekiel stood and approached the bed. He placed his palm on Silas's forehead, and the overseer's mind exploded with sensation. The pain of every lash he'd delivered, the terror of every face he'd struck, the agony of every death he'd caused, all of it compressed into a single eternal moment. When Silas Crow was found the next morning, he was alive but changed. His hair had gone completely white. He could speak, but he only whispered prayers and wept uncontrollably. Nathaniel Whitmore dismissed him that afternoon, disgusted by the broken shell of the man. Silas Crow walked into the woods that evening and was never seen again. Prudence Whitmore considered herself kind, at least compared to her brother. She never struck the house slaves, rarely raised her voice, and sometimes saved sweets from dinner to share. But kindness, Ezekiel would show her, was not the same as justice. He appeared in her room on a Thursday night, materializing from the shadows near her vanity, where she sat brushing her hair. She dropped the brush with a clatter. "How did you? The door is locked." "Locks are for those who believe in them," Ezekiel said. Prudence's hand crept toward the bell pull to summon help, but Ezekiel shook his head. "You gave your maid, Charity, a dress last month, your old blue Sunday dress. You felt generous." Prudence nodded, trembling. "Yes, I wanted to do something nice." Charity's daughter needed medicine. She was burning with fever. Charity begged you for $2 to fetch the doctor. You said no. You just given her the dress, and that should be enough gratitude for one season. The color drained from Prudence's face. I didn't think." "The child died 4 days later. Her name was Grace. She was 7 years old." "No," Prudence whispered. "No, I didn't know she was that ill, I thought." "You thought a worn dress was compensation for a life." Ezekiel's voice remained calm, which somehow made it worse. "You thought your small kindnesses purchased you righteousness." He touched her hand, and Prudence collapsed to her knees, sobbing as she felt the weight of Grace's small body growing cold. Heard Charity's silent screams as she held her dead daughter, experienced the mother's grief as her own. When Prudence woke the next morning slumped against her vanity, she immediately went to her father and confessed everything. She demanded Charity be freed, be given money, be given anything she needed. Cornelius, disturbed by his daughter's hysteria and his wife's strange behavior, began to wonder about the new slave. Nathaniel Whitmore was a man who believed in order. The natural order, as he saw it, placed him at the apex and those he owned at the bottom. He'd heard the whispers about Ezekiel, his mother's sudden compassion, his sister's breakdown, Silas Crow's disappearance. He dismissed it all as coincidence and feminine weakness. He decided to confront Ezekiel directly. That evening, he had the slave brought to the barn under pretense of disciplining him for uppity behavior. 2 other overseers flanked Ezekiel, who walked with quiet dignity, his wrists bound. "I don't know what tricks you're playing," Nathaniel said, circling him like a predator, "but they end tonight. You're going to learn your place." Ezekiel looked at him with those unsettling eyes. "I already know my place. Do you know yours?" The disrespect ignited Nathaniel's rage. He grabbed the whip from the wall and found himself unable to move. The 2 overseers similarly froze, their faces locked in expressions of confusion. Only Ezekiel moved, his bonds falling away like smoke, though no one had untied them. "Your place," Ezekiel said, walking slowly around the paralyzed Nathaniel, "is that of a man who convinced himself that owning others made him great. But let me show you what greatness you've actually achieved." The barn dissolved around them, and Nathaniel found himself experiencing fragments of memories, not his own. A young man named Isaac, talented with woodwork, who might have built beautiful things but instead broke rocks in Nathaniel's fields until his hands were ruined and his spirit crushed. A woman named Esther, who loved music and had a voice like honey, who hummed spirituals while picking cotton until Nathaniel sold her away from her family for talking back. A man named Caleb, who tried to escape to freedom and was caught by Nathaniel personally, dragged back, beaten in front of everyone as an example, and worked until infection from his wounds killed him. On and on, life after life, potential after potential, all ground to dust under Nathaniel's boot. When Nathaniel gasped back into reality, he was alone in the barn, the first rays of dawn creeping through the slats. He stumbled back to the house, his worldview shattered like dropped porcelain. At breakfast, he could barely look at the house slaves serving food. He excused himself and vomited in the garden. Cornelius Whitmore was not a stupid man. As Ezekiel's presence continued to unravel his household, his wife freeing slaves, his daughter in perpetual tears of repentance, his son unable to meet anyone's eyes, he began to investigate the slave's history more thoroughly. He wrote to contacts in South Carolina, in Georgia, in North Carolina. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Every plantation where Ezekiel had been kept had suffered, not through violence or rebellion, but through transformation. Owners overcome with guilt, selling their holdings and moving north. Overseers disappearing or losing their minds. Entire systems of cruelty collapsing from within as those who perpetuated them were forced to confront what they'd done. Some called him a witch, others a prophet. A few whispered he was something older, a spirit of retribution given flesh. The plantation in South Carolina hadn't just burned. Its owner, a man named Beauregard Ashton, had set the fire himself after Ezekiel's visitations, unable to live with the weight of his crimes. He'd freed everyone first, then immolated himself in the mansion. Only Ezekiel had walked away. Cornelius sat in his study, drinking whiskey though it was barely noon, when Ezekiel appeared in the chair across from his desk. Cornelius didn't even startle. He'd been expecting this. "I won't scream," he said quietly. "I won't call for help. I know it won't matter." "No," Ezekiel agreed, "it won't." "What are you?" "I am what happens when suffering becomes sacred, when pain reaches such depths that it transforms into something else." Ezekiel leaned forward. "I am the conscience you tried to bury beneath profit margins and property law." Cornelius swallowed hard. "Are you here to kill me?" "Death would be a mercy," Ezekiel said. "I'm here to make you remember." When Ezekiel touched Cornelius Whitmore's forehead, the plantation owner's mind was flooded with every transaction he'd ever made in human flesh. He felt the ship's hold, packed so tight that breathing was a luxury purchased at another's expense. He felt the auction block's humiliation, standing naked while hands prodded him like livestock. He felt the whip, hundreds of lashes across dozens of backs, each one burning across his consciousness. He felt children torn from mothers, husbands from wives, families shattered across state lines for profit. But Ezekiel didn't just show him actions. He showed him what was stolen. There was a boy named Benjamin who had a gift for mathematics, who calculated crop yields in his head but would never attend a university, never publish a theorem, never be more than good with numbers in the fields. There was a woman named Hannah who could have been a healer, who knew herbs and remedies passed down through generations, but whose knowledge died with her because she was worked to death before she could teach her daughter. There was a man named Thomas who wrote poetry on scraps of paper and hid them under floorboards, beautiful verses that would never be read because teaching him to write was illegal, and his poems were burned when discovered. Potential after potential, dream after dream, life after life, all crushed under the weight of the system Cornelius had profited from and perpetuated. When Cornelius returned to himself, he was weeping, his body racked with sobs so violent he could barely breathe. I never thought. But the words were hollow. He had thought. He'd simply chosen not to care. Ezekiel stood. You have a choice now. You can continue as you are, but you'll carry this weight forever. Every face, every name, every stolen moment. Sleep will bring nightmares. Waking will bring memories. Food will taste like ash. Or, Cornelius gasped, or you can try to make it right. Free them, all of them. Give them what you owe. It won't erase what you've done, but it might let you die with a soul less corrupted than the one you have now. Ezekiel walked to the window, looking out over the fields where people toiled under the brutal sun. Choose quickly, Mr. Whitmore. I've shown you truth. What you do with it determines whether you're simply evil or something that might, eventually, be redeemed. Then he was gone, leaving Cornelius alone with the weight of 237 souls on his conscience, every person he'd ever claimed to own. Dawn broke over Whitmore Plantation on September 15, 1847, and everything had changed. Cornelius emerged from his study, haggard and aged 10 years overnight, and summoned his entire household, family, overseers, and all the enslaved people from the quarters. In a voice that shook with emotion, he read a proclamation. Every person enslaved on his property was hereby freed. He would provide them with papers, money, and assistance going wherever they wished, north to freedom or to search for families sold away. The plantation would be sold, and the proceeds divided among those he'd held in bondage as restitution for stolen labor. His family stared in shock. Nathaniel, still shaken from his own visitation, said nothing. Prudence wept. Abigail nodded as if she'd been waiting for this. The enslaved people stood in stunned silence. Temperance, the elderly woman who'd first recognized Ezekiel's mark, began to sing, a low spiritual that rose like smoke into the morning air. Others joined her, voices swelling with something between grief and hope. Ezekiel stood at the edge of the gathering, apart but present. A young girl named Lily, no more than 10, approached him shyly. "Where will you go, Mr. Ezekiel?" He knelt down to her level, his severe face softening almost imperceptibly. "Wherever I'm needed, child. There are many houses I must visit, many people who have forgotten how to see. Will you make them remember?" "I will try." Over the following weeks, the plantation was indeed sold. Families reunited, some heading north to establish new lives, others staying in Virginia but as free people with money in their pockets. Cornelius kept only enough to live modestly, his health broken by the weight of his awakened conscience. Nathaniel moved to Boston and became an abolitionist speaker, his testimony about his father's plantation lending credence to the movement. Prudence used her inheritance to establish a school for freedmen's children. Abigail finally left her chambers and worked alongside her daughter. And Ezekiel, he vanished the day the last person received their free papers. But across Virginia, then Maryland, then deeper south into Georgia and Mississippi, whispers began to spread among plantation owners. Stories of a tall slave who could enter any locked room, who showed men the truth of their sins, who brought reckoning without violence, only unbearable clarity. Some owners who heard the stories freed their slaves preemptively, fearing what Ezekiel might show them. Others doubled their locks and hired more guards, believing they could keep him out. They were wrong, of course. Locks are only for those who believe in them. And Ezekiel believed in something far older and more powerful than any lock. The weight of truth, the price of conscience, and the long, slow work of justice that visits every house eventually, invited or not. Temperance, who lived to be 97, told her great-grandchildren the story in 1889, when she was free, and the war was long over. "That mark on his wrist," she said, her voice still strong despite her age. "My grandmother said it was the mark of the griot, the keeper of stories, the voice of the silenced. But it was more than that. It was the mark of those who carry the weight of all the suffering, who transform it into something that cannot be ignored or forgotten. "Is he still out there?" her great-grandson asked. Temperance smiled, a sad, knowing expression. "Child, as long as there are those who profit from suffering and tell themselves it's justified, Ezekiel will walk. He'll slip past every lock and chain, into every house that's built on pain." "But slavery's over, Grandma." "Slavery's one name for an old sin," she said. "The sin keeps finding new names, and Ezekiel keeps finding new houses to visit." She looked out the window of her small farmhouse, her own property, bought with her own money on her own land, and her eyes grew distant. "Sometimes, late at night, I still see him walking down the road. Never ages, never tires, never stops, just walks from house to house, making folks remember what they'd rather forget." "Are you scared of him?" "No, child. I'm grateful, because the only thing worse than remembering terrible things is a world where everyone's allowed to forget them." And somewhere, in the darkness of a Mississippi night, a plantation owner woke to find a tall figure standing at the foot of his bed, and the long work of remembering began again. The end.